Isaiah Berlin talked a lot about Giambattista Vico in The Crooked Timber of Humanity, as well as his other book, Against the Current. And what I want to do today, rather than trying to sum up all that he said about Vico throughout these two books, because Vico comes up in almost every chapter of each of those two books, is to focus in on a particular chapter in The Crooked Timber of Humanity. The second chapter in the book, it's entitled Giambattista Vico and Cultural History. And remember, I'm doing this because I want to try to develop what Isaiah Berlin's thoughts were in this intersection that he developed between liberal thought and thought coming out of the Counter-Enlightenment, the Romantic movement and the Counter-Enlightenment movement. And though Vico is before either one of those movements, he was tremendously important to Berlin because, in Berlin's view, he anticipated some of the best insights of those later movements. So Vico was truly extraordinary in that respect. His dates, as you can see there, are 1688 to 1744. And he was from Naples. This was long before Italy became a united country. So that's why it says there, early Neapolitan critic of Enlightenment thought. He wrote The New Science, that was his great work, in 1725. And some of the impacts on Vico that were ongoing or had begun before his birth but were very impactful on him would include the commercial revolution, which got started with the exploration of the rest of the world, you might say, by the Europeans. The scientific revolution, of course. The Reformation, of course, and the splintering, therefore, of Christianity would have been impactful on Vico. The agricultural revolution was ongoing, mentioned that last time as well, where land was being used differently and farming was becoming more consolidated into fewer hands already, all the way back then. And also, and most importantly, the early Enlightenment. And it was the early Enlightenment in particular that struck Vico as problematic, and so he devotes a lot of his energy to responding to it, to criticizing, at a time when many other people were not as aware or had not thought through as well some of the more harmful ramifications of Enlightenment thought. So you can see here I've tried to place Vico in what was going on in and around his time. Very significantly, he responded negatively to Descartes' methodology. He was very aware of and very critical of Descartes. He was also familiar with Thomas Hobbes's thought. For those of you who are not familiar with Hobbes, Hobbes was a very early sort of proto-Enlightenment thinker, born in 1588, died in 1679, so Vico would have had plenty of opportunity to understand Hobbes's works, and Hobbes was a very thoroughgoing materialist. He tried to reduce even human mind, human spirit, pretty much everything to the material level and to a sort of mechanistic worldview. And he developed his political theory on that basis. And so, as I often say, even though Hobbes was an advocate of absolute monarchy, he built the foundations of his particular advocacy of it on these what he considered very scientific grounds, materialistic grounds. He developed the idea of the social contract, the idea that government was created, nothing more than a creation of people to achieve certain specific ends. So Vico was familiar with Hobbes. He would have been familiar with Locke's and Spinoza's ideas too. So he would have been able to absorb early Enlightenment, social contract, and rationalistic thinking. Voltaire and Rousseau Later Enlightenment thinkers would not have been on Vico's scene or radar screen. Their times don't overlap enough with his. And interestingly, in the late 1700s, German philosopher Goethe picked up on Vico's thoughts on history, and also Vico was of influence on Karl Marx and his view of history. So in this chapter on Vico, Isaiah Berlin first talks about the Enlightenment attitude towards history to set up Vico as a source of a different attitude or a different treatment of history. So this is a great quote from that chapter in The Crooked Timber of Humanity, where Berlin discusses how Enlightenment philosophers viewed the job of historians. Historians must not clutter the minds of their readers with the absurdities of religion, the ravings of idiots and savages, or the inventions of knaves, unless it be as cautionary tales to warn mankind of the horrors of barbarism and tyranny. This deeply unhistorical approach to the nature of men and societies is common enough in the 18th century, and derives in part from the phenomenal success of the exact sciences in the previous century, which led Descartes, for example, to look on the study of history as unworthy of intelligent men interested in the advancement of objective knowledge. So there, Berlin notes that in Descartes' view, there really wasn't much of a point to studying history, and that would have been because previously human beings did not think objectively enough and scientifically enough, and they weren't as rational, and therefore, why bother studying what they thought? Why take time to try to get back into their frame of mind, which is something that couldn't be done anyway. Berlin also notes that in the 18th and 19th century there was this resentment that grew against especially the French Enlightenment philosophes and their followers. And he makes the reference to the literary mandarins of Paris in the 18th century. And he says that this resentment led some historians and jurists to focus on the uniqueness of historical development in their particular place. So he gives as an example, quote, British and Swiss scholars who began to investigate legends, sagas, early poetry historically as the vehicles of self-expression of particular peoples. So this resentment and reaction, Berlin says, becomes the Romantic movement, but we have Vico, who comes along well before that movement and anticipates much of it. So this is why he turns to Vico. He says, Vico is the true father both of the modern concept of culture and of what one might call cultural pluralism, according to which each authentic culture has its own unique vision, its own scale of values, which in the course of development is superseded by other visions and values, but never wholly so. That is, earlier value systems do not become totally unrecognizable to succeeding generations. In that quote, I just want to emphasize this notion that each culture has its own unique vision and its own scale of values. This, I think, drew criticism from other people towards Berlin that he was engaging in a kind of relativistic way of thinking, that he was too much of a historicist. Because of that, he was suspect as a liberal. How could one be a good liberal and not believe that, say, progress is more or less infinite and ongoing and leading towards the best system for all, which would be something like liberal democracy. So anybody who makes this kind of argument is going to be suspect by those who think there is that one best system. And, Berlin is saying this is what the Enlightenment was about, was this belief in the one best system, and he is using Vico to challenge that assumption. So, yes, he is doing that, but yet at the same time Berlin is trying to guard himself against the criticism of relativism. And he also does that through his discussion of Vico. And that's why Vico is extra important for us to understand if we want to understand Berlin, because he derives both ends of his argument, both ends, or at least two very important parts of his argument, from the thoughts of Vico. So, while Vico argues that the differences amongst cultures are very real, deep, and irreconcilable, meaning that one is not going to be able to see the other as better than itself, right? We are, as human beings, capable of recognizing other cultures not as better than our own, but as recognizably human, and therefore operating in the same realm, in the same region as our own, as human cultures, products of the human mind and imagination. So he says it's possible, by a sufficient effort of imagination, to grasp what the world must have looked like to creatures remote in time and space, who practiced such rites and used such worlds and created such works of art. So Vico is countering the Enlightenment philosophers in their assumption that people who lived in the past or in the world now and aren't sufficiently enlightened are somehow not quite human, that they are, and I'm using these words that they would have used, barbaric, primitive, superstitious, and all of these terms indicate that these people were not as evolved as the people of the Enlightenment. For those people, it would not have seemed possible or desirable to try to get their minds back into what these other people were thinking of when they carried on their religious rites or, created works of art that seemed to the Enlightenment philosophers as too primitive. Why would we want to do that? It wouldn't seem to them to get us anywhere. It would be a backward step to admire this previous stage, is the way that they would have looked at it. But Vico is not looking at history as stages in a story of progress, but rather as a myriad of expressions of deeply, equally human values. Berlin spends some time on Descartes, and because Vico is answering the Cartesian worldview, Descartes, of course, thought that an objective human mind could objectively observe the material world. In my slide there, I use the term imagined on purpose because, as it turns out, the idea that there is an objective mind that can objectively observe a separate material world that is separable from mind is it's a story or a narrative. It's not necessarily the truth. And I think that this is part of the insight that one can get from thinkers like Vico, is that this is another worldview and a sort of paradigm, you might say, of that encompasses the way people of a particular time and place look at their place in the world and how they're going to interact with it. But it isn't the only one. But for people living within a particular culture and what Charles Taylor might call an imaginary, most of them can't see beyond the imaginary and take it for a universal and eternally valid truth, a way of thinking that if other people didn't share in previous times or they don't share now in other places, they're just wrong. The Cartesian worldview placed the era of scientific thought at the pinnacle of human history, as if history was a march from a dark and ignorant human adolescence to an age of absolute knowledge. That's the Enlightenment. And there wasn't any room in the Cartesian worldview for this project that Vico undertook of what Berlin calls imaginative insight, or the entering into or descending into the minds of primitive men, or Fantasia. Now, I know that I think there's some sort of Disney World movie, Fantasia, or something like that, trying to not let that fact that that's out there fool you or make you think that there's something light-hearted about the term, and understand what he's trying to say. Fantasia for Vico and for Berlin is this, what I would call active imagination, a very empathetic imagination of finding the commonality that does exist among human beings because they're human, and enough commonality to be able to project yourself into their frame of mind, their culture, at least enough that you can understand their motivations and how they might have arrived at their conclusions. And all of this would, of course, give people more of a sense of respect, understanding, tolerance, ability to take the insights that that particular culture did give to humankind and appreciate them rather than seeing them as products of a backward way of thinking. Here I have a picture of Charles Taylor because Taylor was Isaiah Berlin's student, and in A Secular Age, the rather lengthy book that won him the Templeton Prize, he definitely employs Fantasia. It's an ongoing attempt, that book is, to get back into the frame of mind of other people and to see how, from their perspective, they developed their ideas and ways of life and how all that led to our own. So you can really see the influence of Isaiah Berlin on Charles Taylor. Vico famously said, human beings can fully understand only what they have made, and they cannot fully understand what they have not made. By the way, there's a series of lectures by Leo Strauss on Vico. There's a whole seminar that Leo Strauss taught on Vico that you can find on the Strauss Center website, and he makes much of this, this idea that Vico had, that people cannot fully understand what they have not made, and therefore Vico said, we really can't understand the natural world. We should put most of our efforts into understanding the human world. That's why the study of history is so important. And through Fantasia, he said, we can understand different visions of life and their values which cannot be represented as capable of fitting into one great harmonious structure. So if we think this way, we may be able to take a step back from our own position and see, for instance, that we may actually be superior to earlier peoples in rational thought, for instance, but he said we do not, for that very reason, possess, this is, by the way, this is Berlin again, for that very reason we do not possess the marvelous elemental power of imagination or language of the magnificent epics and sagas like, I say, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which only a brutal and primitive culture can produce. And he says, for Vico, there is no true progress in the arts. The genius of one age cannot be compared with that of another. Homer's Iliad, in particular, is referenced by Berlin as an example, and is really a good example. You see in the Iliad, in particular, this notion that the ancient Greeks had, that a rather violent, highly skilled warrior of great ability and talent could earn the respect of everybody, and should not be faulted for what we would consider to be an enormous ego. I mean, the Iliad starts out with Achilles being enraged because Agamemnon does not give him all of the prizes and all of the things that and treasures that he thought that he should give him in recognition for his ability and his heroism in battle against the Trojans. And he keeps up that rage through thick and thin, as you know if you've read the book. But you get the sense that Homer and the people that this story would have been told to were not saying that Achilles was wrong or somehow immoral for throwing what we would consider sort of a almost treasonous temper tantrum. And that it just shows you very clearly how the values and what people admired in ancient Greece were different than our own, which are heavily influenced by Christianity. So notice, though, that if we read the Iliad, we can recognize these people as human. We can project ourselves into their culture to a certain extent. We can come to admire Achilles on their terms. It's quite interesting. All the while not agreeing with his particular set of values or deciding that we're going to be like Achilles. Near the end of this chapter, Berlin says that to judge the attainments of one age by applying to them a single absolute criterion, that of the critics and theorists of a later period, not only is unhistorical and anachronistic, but rests on a fallacy, the assumption of the existence of timeless standards. So here we have Berlin saying there are no timeless human standards. There's no one set of standards that can be applied to people at every place, every time, in every situation. And in dealing with that and accepting that, we can then come to see the contributions of other peoples in a different light, in a more helpful light. Now, hopefully next time I will get into this idea of a common humanity that kind of underlies the diversity, the cultural diversity that he sees. All right, see you next time. Bye.